US President Donald Trump has affirmed that the ceasefire in Gaza is holding after an explosion of violence in the region over the weekend.
Israel carried out airstrikes across Gaza that killed dozens after accusing Hamas of carrying out an attack that killed 2 IDF soldiers, the first major test of the fragile truce.
The leaders of the Palestinian armed group have denied any involvement on the Israeli soldiers.
Now, both sides have recommitted to the ceasefire plan, which Washington has vowed to guarantee.
We want to make sure that it's going to be very peaceful with Hamas, and as you know, they've been quite rambunctious. They've been doing some shooting, and we think maybe the leadership isn't involved in that. You know, some rebels within, but either way, it's going to be handled properly. It's going to be handled toughly, but properly.
Is the ceasefire still in place?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Let's take you back to the story that we began the hour with. US President Donald Trump reaffirming that the ceasefire in Gaza remained in place after an explosion of violence in the region over the weekend. Israel carried out airstrikes across Gaza that killed dozens after accusing Hamas of carrying out an attack that killed 2 IDF soldiers, the first major test of the fragile truce. Now, Hamas leadership denied any involvement in the IDF attack, and both sides have recommitted to the ceasefire plan, which Washington has vowed to guarantee.
We want to make sure that it's going to be very peaceful with Hamas, and as you know, they've been quite rambunctious. They've been doing some shooting, and we think maybe the leadership isn't involved in that. You know, some rebels within, but either way, it's going to be handled properly. It's going to be handled toughly, but properly.
Is the ceasefire still in place?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
All right, let's stay with us and speak to SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, good evening to you, and thanks so much for your time. The United States essentially acknowledging the fragility of the moment and also dispatching U.S. envoys to the region, with Vice President J.D. Vance also due in Israel tomorrow. What more do we know?
Well, Bongiwe, essentially, if you had any doubts as to whether this was a fragile truce, a fragile ceasefire, look no further than the events over this past weekend. An attack on Israeli forces in the south. Israel then, as you would expect, responding with airstrikes across Gaza. But there you heard President Trump reasserting that the truce was still holding, dispatching his Middle East envoys, including Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, that really were catalytic in getting that agreement across the finish line. You also, in your introduction, mentioned that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, will be landing in Israel tomorrow. And that really speaks to the urgency of the moment and the role that the United States is playing here in terms of guaranteeing this truce. Of course, there are still many things to be resolved in terms of the second phase of the ceasefire. You have seen all the living hostages released so far. There are still a number of hostages, deceased hostages, whose bodies are being recovered. A complicated task, given the levels of destruction that you know exist in Gaza. But these are some of the things that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are now discussing with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his team. We also understand that they will travel to Egypt, to Cairo later, for direct talks under the auspices of Egypt's mediation with Hamas to talk about the second phase. Part of that second phase has to do with a transitional authority that will govern Gaza in the absence of the Palestinian Authority perhaps taking over. These are some of the permutations that still need to be addressed. We also a short time ago heard from the UN in terms of developments over the weekend, access in terms of humanitarian aid entering the Strip. This is what the Secretary General's spokesperson said moments ago.
We are encouraged that the parties have reaffirmed their commitments to implementing the ceasefire in Gaza and commend the steadfast efforts of the mediators. We do, however, remain concerned by all acts of violence in Gaza and the reported attacks and strikes that took place yesterday. We urge all parties to honor all of their commitments to ensure the protection of civilians and avoid any actions that could lead to a renewal of hostilities and undermine humanitarian operations.
And Bongiwe, as much as we've seen an upscaling of aid entering the enclave since this ceasefire took hold about 10 days ago, There was a brief suspension over the weekend when the skirmishes took place. We understand that Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, is in Jerusalem as I'm speaking to you, speaking to humanitarian partners. The broad message is, yes, aid is getting in at a larger scale. It's still not where it needs to be. So that work, part of the broader conversation of implementing the ceasefire arrangement.
And Sherwin, we also understand, of course, that, plans are also afoot towards a new UN Security Council resolution. This is to allow for an international stabilization force to operate and also provide security in Gaza now during this particular transition phase, as you've just told us. But what else do we know about this?
I wish I could give you more, right? We understand that European and American officials are driving a text, a product that would emanate from the UN Security Council. But we also understand, Bongiwe, that it's not going to be a traditional UN peacekeeping force. So, what the parameters look like. These are still things that are being discussed by diplomats here, being led from capitals in the region and around the world. But in terms of a transitional phase, we understand that there is work now being done on an international stabilization force. Let me just read you something I got from a European diplomat asking them, how's this working out? How's this moving forward? This was the response. We remain committed to doing all we can to ensure that phase 2 of President Trump's plan is enacted at pace and continue to work with a range of partners, including the United States, Europeans and countries in the region. The terms of reference for an international stabilization force are still being drawn up. I've also seen reports that Egypt could be in the lead here, Jordan also in the lead, but it could be made up of countries around the region, right? There's a concept called TCCs, troop contributing countries. Who will those troops come from? What are those engagements looking like? These are all unanswered questions, but the long-term goal here is in terms of this transition phase, there is work being done on an international stabilization force, which at the end of the day, Israel as the occupier that controls that region would have to agree to. And that in and of itself remains a high bar.
Sherwin, lots of uncertainties, but thank you so much for chatting to us. My colleague there, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, live for us in New York.